Hey, it's Andy Blanks here with another teacher prep video for our Amplify Bible study curriculum. This teacher prep video is for Amplify Lesson 14. Now, Amplify Lesson 14 is the first lesson in a 3-lesson look at God's mercy. Now, this is really cool. God's mercy, if you just kind of come at it with a fresh slate and you're just like considering God's mercy, it's real easy for us to kind of think about God's mercy and God's grace and His goodness and kindness kind of all mixed together. And there definitely is that connotation that those are all sort of attributes that flow out of God's character and His love. There's not a tremendous amount of difference in those meanings. However, there's a little bit of difference here, and we want to talk about that difference, the difference in God's grace and the difference in God's mercy and His kindness. Even though they're kind of definitely overlapping, the way we understand God's mercy, there's a really good definition we're going to use kind of throughout this study. And that is God's mercy is the kindness He shows, His goodness shown to those who are in need or in distress. Okay, so that's a little bit different than like His grace or His kindness, His goodness. They're all wrapped together. But God's mercy specifically is God responding in goodness, responding in love to those who need Him, to those who are in distress. So we're going to help your students kind of understand that in this first lesson. We're going to lay that groundwork for understanding how God's mercy flows out of who He is. And we're going to look at Old Testament passages when we do this. We're going to look at a couple verses from the Psalms and then an interesting kind of narrative to show God modeling this. The first thing we're going to do is look at how God's mercy kind of is who He is. It's tied to His character, especially God's mercy to those in need. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of places in Scripture we could have gone to, particularly in the Psalms. But we've chosen a passage in Psalms that just kind of reflects this statement, helps drive home this point, where David basically just says, he's talking to God and he's like crying out to God. He's asking God to hear his prayers. And he says, remember, he says, respond to me basically in your mercy, for it is from the days of old. It's basically this idea that God's mercy is as timeless as God's character. It's tied to who God is. It's part of His attributes and it's eternal. God has always been merciful. And God responds to us out of His mercy. That's the second point. Is we're going to look at that God. If God only heard our cries and didn't respond to our cries, He would be cruel, right? But God hears our cries and responds to them. God hears our needs. He hears us in distress. And that's, again, there are plenty of places we could have looked at in Scripture to prove this point. We've chosen a psalm, a real simple psalm that basically just says, when David's talking about his enemies surrounding him and he's in distress and he called out to the Lord and the Lord heard his cry. The Lord answered him in His mercy and answered his prayer. God is merciful. He cares about us. He answers us. He hears our prayers, especially when we're in distress. And especially there's a little bit of a connotation here when it comes to God's mercy. Not always, but often, that we might not deserve God's mercy, that we cry out for mercy in cases when sometimes we've sinned and we're experiencing the consequences of sin, and that's not cool. And we cry out for God and His mercy, and even in those cases, God hears our cries. There's a story. It's a narrative that you're going to go through. You're going to give a little context to it. We're kind of picking up the story in midstream, but it's this really it's kind of one of these interesting Old Testament stories that we can't quite grasp. Maybe immediately like the importance of it, because there's some cultural differences here. There's the gap of 3,000 or 4,000 years that is kind of hard for us to understand. But essentially, God has kind of told David not to count his soldiers, not to take a census of his fighting men, because to do that would be to put David's faith in numbers, to put David's faith in his men and himself and not in God. And David does that anyway. Even after being kind of rebuked by one of his people, David tells one of his guys, hey, go out and count my soldiers. And the guy's like, that's kind of a bad idea. You sure you want to do that? David does it anyway. And as soon, this is so like us, right? As soon as the guys come back and report to him how many fighting men he has, David just crumples. He's like, oh gosh, I should not have done this. I've sinned against God, directly against God. And God actually comes to him and basically says, hey, there's some consequences for your sin. They kind of stink. You actually get to choose. And God kind of gives him a list of consequences. And David falls on his face and he's like, oh God, deal with me according to your mercy. We're gonna choose a consequence for my sin, because all sin has consequences. But I'm throwing myself on the mercy of God. And basically, here's the thing that stinks. A result of David's sin is that there are people who die. God is judging Israel because of David. And thousands of people die. But even though there is consequences for sin. God stops his judgment. It could have been much worse. God stops his judgment and says, you know what? This is as far as it goes. This is as far as it goes. I'm stopping my judgment here because David has cried out for my mercy. And so I'm going to show mercy even though I'm letting David experience the consequence of his sin. I'm going to stop. I'm going to cut my judgment short out of mercy for David. So in that, we just tie all these together and we see that God gives us mercy when we need it. We cry out to God in distress. When your students are dealing with life's troubles and the things the world is throwing at them, God is there. He hears their cries for distress. He has mercy on them. He has kindness. Even in the midst of their sin, they can cry out to God. And God has the right from who he is to extend mercy, even in those moments, okay? So I'm praying that this lesson goes great for you guys. I hope that it's something that's very meaningful and that it's a topic that maybe we don't always cover with our students. And so this will be a good moment to really dig in and open their eyes to an aspect of God's character that is just powerful in nature. So I hope this lesson goes great for you. And I'll see you again on another Teacher Prep video. Take care.